Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about cranial nerves. We're going to talk about the very basic principles of how cranial nerves are arranged and ways that we can think about them in terms of learning what they're about. Cranial nerves are no different to spinal nerves. Well, that's true for most cranial nerves, not all. If we draw ourselves a brain and a spinal cord, and if you remember from before, spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. Actually, we'll just label this spinal cord, brain. If we remember, spinal nerves come off the spinal cord and they go out the periphery. We have spinal nerves that come off at each single level along the spinal cord. Some come off in the cervical region, that's the neck region. Some come off in the thorax region. Some come off in the lumbar region, and some come off in the sacral region. And these spinal nerves have a motor and a sensory component. And if you remember clearly, the sensory component is actually in two parts: the normal pain, temperature and touch component, and the special proprioceptive component. And just to add to the complication, just as a little reminder, remember that in the thoracic region there is output for the autonomic nervous system as well, that hitchhikes along with these spinal nerves that come off at the level of the thorax. And that autonomic component is the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. Now do remember that this only happens in the thoracic region and only applies to the sympathetic component of the autonomic nervous system. So spinal nerves are regularly distributed up the spinal cord. And in fact, for those who remember their embryology, there is one spinal nerve for each somite that you are composed of. So each spinal nerve is an output to a single building block from embryology. And if you remember, those somites in embryology are sort of repetitive, I describe them as pizza boxes piled up to produce the human body. And each somite sort of is autonomous in its evolutionary origin, in that it has a single nerve, a single artery, and a single little bundle of muscle that it's composed of. And the nerve, as I said, in an adult, that nerve is a spinal nerve. So that's how spinal nerves are arranged in the spinal cord. The difference then becomes, what do we do about the head region? How do we provide supplies to the head region? And how do we supply the basic sensory and motor? And the next problem is that we have all these special sensations. And those special sensations are like sight, hearing, smell, all those things unique to the head region. And on top of our problem, we have the other part of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, we have the parasympathetic as well. And somehow we need to get the parasympathetic component of the autonomic nervous system out from the central nervous system to join in to its activity in the peripheral nervous system. So this is where cranial nerves come in. cranial nerves are really the equivalent of spinal nerves, but they come off the brain, and in fact that's their definition, nerves that come off the brain, but they have a group of different functions. They have sensory functions, just the same sorts of sensory functions as you would see in spinal nerves. They have motor functions, just the same sorts of motor functions that you would see in spinal nerves. They have the uniquely special sensations that you only find in the head, and they have a bunch of the parasympathetic output. So you can now see that cranial nerves are really having a whole bunch of functions, but anatomically they just are the same style of thing that you see in spinal nerves. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this discussion into two halves. I'm now going to take this discussion and move on and talk about it in an anatomical form. And in a separate video, we will talk about it in a functional form for cranial nerves. So let's move on and talk about this in an anatomical form. So, cranial nerves. What are they? In pure anatomical form, they are a sequence of nerves that come off the brain. And they are symmetric, left and right is the same. And there are actually 12 cranial nerves. We don't write them in our standard numeric form. We write them in Roman numerals. So we number them from 1 through to 12. And this separates them when we write from the spinal nerves. And each of these cranial nerves are numbered from 1 to 12 in the order in which they come off the brain. 1 being towards the top, and 12 being the very last one just before the spinal cord. Let's just draw in a spinal cord to remind us. Here is a spinal cord here. So very simply, they're a sequence of nerves that look the same in a sense as spinal nerves, except they come off the brain. Now, unlike spinal nerves, each of these cranial nerves get their own name. The names are tricky because the names are neither a whole bunch of anatomical names, nor are they a whole bunch of functional names. There's a mixture of names. So, for example, the first cranial nerve 1, is called the olfactory nerve. And the olfactory nerve runs off to supply your sense of smell. The second cranial nerve is called the optic nerve, which we've all heard the derivation of that word before. So this nerve is the nerve that takes information back to your brain from your retina to provide vision. So these two cranial nerves are all named after the function that they provide, whereas the third cranial nerve is called the oculomotor. And that cranial nerve, let's get this O neatened up there, that cranial nerve is actually going to go off to supply some of the small muscles around your eye, and it is a motor nerve. So that has a sort of slightly different variation. And the next nerve is even worse. The next nerve, the fourth nerve, is called the trochlear nerve. And this name bears no relationship to its function. You do know that these two cranial nerves are actually very closely related, and the trochlear nerve goes off to a single little muscle that assists in moving the eye. So these two nerves are functionally related, and we'll talk more about the functional story later. But anatomically, the fourth cranial nerve is named after a little part of that muscle that it supplies. The fifth cranial nerve has an interesting name as well. The fifth cranial nerve is called the trigeminal. Now, this name bears no relationship to there's no systemization of the names related to the others at all. Tri, as you know, means three, tricycle, and geminal means to germinate. So this nerve germinates as three. So in other words, it starts its journey in three parts. So really, this is a purely anatomical description of what this cranial nerve is. And this, just out of interest, this is the largest cranial nerve in the body. And this cranial nerve is one that's very important to people who are working in the head and neck region, such as dentists or oral health therapists or those sorts of people. And just to continue the story on, the sixth cranial nerve is called the abducent. And it's in fact another partner in those nerves that are going off to supply muscles of the eye. But this name is related to what that muscle does. The muscle that this nerve supplies abducts the eye, or in other words, it moves the eyeball away from the midline. So this name is directly related to the function of the muscle that this nerve supplies. So you can see these nerves all have a various sequence of names, and please go away and look up the names of the rest of these nerves. You will need to know them. So lots of people find all sorts of tricky ways at first to learn them as a sort of song or a mnemonic or something like that. In the end, these nerves will actually mean something to you and you'll just know their names. So please spend some time, look up the other cranial nerve names and start to think about learning them. To add more complexity to the story, each of these cranial nerves at their core have a different set of functions. For example, the olfactory and optic nerves, they are very special nerves. In fact, technically, they aren't nerves. They're actually bits of your brain growing out on stalks. So these are very special cranial nerves, and they are the other special cranial nerve in the cranial nerves is the eighth cranial nerve that is going to head off and supply the ear. So they are unique, special things. Just as a quirky fact, you might like to know that your retina is actually a piece of your brain that has grown out on a stalk. And these other cranial nerves have other sets of functions. For example, we already know that the oculomotor nerve is a motor nerve that's going to supply muscles around the eye. But it also has in it, hitching a ride along with it, a bunch of parasympathetic as well. Whereas the trochlear nerve is purely motor, and the trigeminal nerve has sensory, and it is mostly sensory, with a little bit of motor. And the abducent nerve is a pure motor nerve. So you can see just from this first half of the cranial nerves that their actual actions and functions is quite complicated. There is a high bunch of variation between cranial nerves. And I want to spend just 2 minutes highlighting the trigeminal nerve. Because the trigeminal nerve has a core part of the story is around that embryological story that we talked about earlier, where the body was made up of somites, and each somite had an independent sort of nerve, muscle and artery supply to it. The trigeminal nerve is part of that embryological origin of the body as well. If you remember back to basic embryology, the head is fundamentally formed by pharyngeal arches. Now, just to remind you, this is embryology. You don't see pharyngeal arches in adults. But if you wanted to see what a pharyngeal arch was like, go down the fish market and have a look at the gills of a fish. Because the gills of a fish are actually each of the pharyngeal arches. And if you were to count them, you would see that there was 6. And in human and mammals and all creatures, there are 6 pharyngeal arches. And these arches grow and expand to form the head region of the body. The first pharyngeal arch, Pharyngeal arch 1, Pharyngeal arch 1 is the most is the pharyngeal arch that makes many of the large important structures to the system of eating. And in fact, the muscles that this pharyngeal arch produces are called the muscles of mastication. And they are the large chewing muscles. The nerves that come out to supply these muscles and to supply sensory motor and to supply sensory supply the structures related to this pharyngeal arch. So the motor supply purely runs to the muscles of mastication, and the sensory supply supplies basically your face. Because basically almost all of your facial skin and tissues are of pharyngeal arch 1 origin. So you can see that the nerve associated with pharyngeal arch 1 has motor and sensory functions. And this nerve is, you guessed it, the trigeminal nerve. So the principles of somites being a building block or a building block of the body, that principle is replicated in the construction, the embryology of the head. And the pharyngeal arches 1 through 6 take responsibility for constructing different parts of the head. So in fact I laughingly say to students that really a human is 40 odd pizza boxes stacked up with a fish head stuck on top. Because the 40 odd pizza boxes are the somites, and the fish head is a representation of the pharyngeal arches that produce your head. So trigeminal nerve, getting back to our cranial nerve story, trigeminal nerve is a special cranial nerve in that it takes responsibility for supplying structures from the first pharyngeal arch. And we'll see later that other cranial nerves take responsibility for other pharyngeal arches. Just to give you a quick heads up, cranial nerve 7 takes responsibility for pharyngeal arch 2. Cranial nerve 9 takes responsibility for pharyngeal arch 3, and then it gets really complicated after that. We talk about 4, 5 and 6 as sort of an integrated group, and really the 10th cranial nerve and its partner, the 11th, take responsibility for structures of origin of pharyngeal arches 4, 5 and 6. So that is the cranial nerve story from an anatomical perspective. In a separate video, I'll talk in more detail how you can easily get the principles of the functions of cranial nerves under control. Thank you.